Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I think this special issue provides a really impelling justification about why we should focus on children's well-being generally, but particularly in protracted crises. And the evidence, a lot of the evidence in here shows that there are detrimental long-term impacts of crises on adults and children. In particular, the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage and poverty is exacerbated by a neglect of children's needs and rights. So it's really a welcome addition or provision to us at this time. So what I'm going to do is try and raise maybe 4 or 5 points that will hopefully open up discussion. Perhaps give some of my own views that others might find contentious. So that's hopefully will give us something useful to talk about. So all the points, they're somewhat related, but they might seem not quite as fluid as you would think. So first of all, I was wondering, reading through this issue, whether we should be making a difference in policy and programming when we respond to different types of crises. Because the issue does talk about, okay, we've got this double dip, protracted crisis, what should we do? Is it different? And I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, it is a useful distinction in as far as we can make the case that the reversibility of different coping strategies is different in different crises. So, for example, Bina Agrawal in her work, seminal work a long time ago, made the point in rural India that when you have seasonality versus calamity, you have very different types of coping mechanisms going on in families that have more and more irreversible consequences. So when you have, say, a seasonal shock, you might reduce your consumption, but if the next day you've got enough money, you can just increase your consumption again. It's very reversible. But as crises get worse or deeper or more protracted, you end up having to do things such as prostitution or migration that becomes permanent, so the family dissolves, and all of a sudden those coping strategies become less and less reversible. And does that mean that we actually need different policies and responses? Of course, now we're sitting in this, what we think is a double-dip recession, and we don't know how long it's going to be. We're quite reactive, and we go, gosh, we need some different responses. But obviously, what we would rather have is to have some forward-looking preparedness around all kinds of responses, ideally, because we really don't know what any kind of crisis will look like until it's upon us. So, I'm saying, well, actually, in terms of responding to them, we actually need a very sort of forward-looking preparedness strategy that looks quite similar. And hopefully we can think creatively going forward about how we can scale different types of response. So, for example, I work a lot on the productive safety net in Ethiopia, and that is going to be coming to an end in 2014. But a lot of the donors and development partners and government are thinking about how can we make social safety nets scalable in response to crises, shocks, famines, droughts. How do we build in scalability? And I think we already heard from Ariel that in Latin America, quite a lot of the examples where you've got huge scale national systems which have been institutionalized, a lot of capacity, they have gone to scale much more easily than we look in Africa and other countries. So we can learn some lessons there. There's also potentially some creative thinking around rapid social response funds that Ravi Kambor and the World Bank have been talking about a lot. Perhaps a global fund that you can set up for a social protection floor in the event of crises. So thinking about how we prepare in advance for different types of crises and should we have different strategies. Another point I want to make is the policy response to crises. In the special issue, we talk about cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, and I come with a social protection hat on because that's what I've been working on for many years. And while conditional cash transfers obviously can be very effective at helping households smooth consumption and smooth household income, I would say that they're a very blunt instrument for addressing child and carer specific needs. Well, they might not be, but we don't really have the evidence to say what Nicola was talking about, what actually goes on in terms of intra-household distribution and access with cash transfers. We know from Maxine Molyneux's work that conditional cash transfers in Mexico and other places cause concerns for women because of the additional burden they have of showing up at healthcare services and taking the kids to school. What happens in the event of a crisis? Does that stress play out in different ways such that even though the household income might be there from a macro perspective, we go in and we do our survey and go, okay, great, the household smoothed its income and consumption. What happened to the women and the children? Are we able to set up monitoring systems or any kind of systems during a crisis that would allow us to look at those specific intra-household and intra-generational? I've had a lot of work from South Africa I've been doing on the child support grant there. We did qualitative work looking at how households spending these child support grant funds, and particularly if you've got multiple generations living under the same roof, you get a lot of conflict. If you've got a teenage mom and her daughter and the matriarch who controls that cash. That's just in a non-crisis situation. If you stick a crisis on top, what happens? Are we able to track how things change? And is that a useful thing to do? Another point I want to make is around the issue of formal and less formal or non-formal safety net, and whether they substitute or crowd each other out during crises. So crisis comes and we all go, quick, let's just put loads of cash transfers in here, because that's what we've seen happen. What happens to these non-formal, informal mechanisms? There's a big assumption that in crises, non-formal mechanisms are stretched. There's a big assumption in Africa they're stretched to the limit. I don't know the evidence of that, but it's pretty much a held truth at this point. So what happens when a crisis comes? Do we undermine these potentially very valuable still informal mechanisms? Or how, if we assume that the crisis is going to end at some point, how do we build back those informal mechanisms that might have become eroded? Should we be thinking about that? Or should we say, okay, well, they've gone, we've had a protracted crisis, family breakdown, all sorts of problems, we're going to keep paying formal now? Is there a role to say, actually, we need to think about how we keep these going and build them back again so we can withdraw from formal provisioning? Two other issues. One is around poverty, chronic poverty versus acute poverty. So the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia came out of a history of emergency appeals in Ethiopia. Every time there's a drought or a famine, the donors, the development partners go for an emergency appeal and they deal with an acute problem. And then the Productive Safety Net came along and said, actually, you know what, even though we're dealing with this acute problem quite well, we still have this chronic caseload of about 5 million people who never shift out of poverty. So how can we build a system that actually allows us to deal with this massive amount of poverty? And I was wondering, in the case of crises, which sometimes can be acute, we don't know how long they're going to be, is it enough to come in with sort of standard social protection or other policies and say, okay, we're going to deal with this problem? Do we still need to keep an eye on the fact that actually even after the crisis there's this massive chronic problem that potentially needs different types of instruments, such as the ones that Nicola were talking about, to do more with access, to do with inclusion, to do with countering discrimination, to do with empowerment? And how do we keep an eye on them during a crisis when we've got less resources? Is there some kind of trade-off? Do we have to forfeit some instruments to be able to do other instruments? And the last point I would like to make is essentially, given that we're going to have a budget constraint in a crisis, obviously, and of course we can think about creative financing, but do we need to think about prioritization, and how would we think about prioritizing different initiatives, particularly in relation to children's well-being? And how do we go about getting a consensus on that? So we might be interested in growth, we might be interested in social issues and dealing with social vulnerabilities. Should we be saying, okay, we want to deal with just under fives and youth, because youth seem to be neglected in a large way in terms of how you get this massive youth bulge who have had all these aspirations built up through their education that they're going to get great jobs, and now you're getting a contraction in the labour market. How are you going to deal with that transition for them? And I'm just wondering if there's a space or places where we can think about how to prioritise the types of social protection we want to put in place for children. Of course, I would say definitely maintaining basic service provision and access and food security. But above that, what more should we be thinking about? So I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's enough questions to think about.